I never imagined that being a widower at 55 would teach me more about human nature than my 30 years as a history professor ever did. After Eleanor's funeral 6 months ago, I thought I understood loss. I thought I knew what betrayal felt like. I was wrong about both. Please subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what city you're watching from. My daughter Sarah had been my anchor during those dark months. She'd drive over from across town twice a week, sometimes bringing her husband Mason along. He was always polite, always helpful, carrying groceries or fixing whatever needed attention around the house. A good man, I told myself. Eleanor would have liked him. Mason spoke English perfectly, but with that slight German accent that reminded everyone he wasn't from here. He'd moved to our small Indiana town 3 years ago when he married Sarah. An engineer, he'd said, though work had been scarce lately. They'd been living off Sarah's nursing salary while he looked for something in his field. The first time I noticed something odd was during Sunday dinner 2 weeks ago. Sarah was in the kitchen preparing dessert when Mason's phone rang. He glanced at the caller ID and stepped outside to the back porch, speaking in rapid German. I didn't think much of it then. Family from home, probably. But yesterday changed everything. It was a warm Thursday afternoon, and I was grading papers in my study when I heard voices in the backyard. Sarah's car was in the driveway, so I assumed they'd come for another visit. Through my window, I could see Mason pacing near Eleanor's rose garden, phone pressed to his ear, gesticulating as he spoke. Something about his posture struck me as agitated, almost secretive. Without really thinking about it, I walked to the back door and stepped outside, planning to offer him some iced tea. That's when I heard him clearly. He was speaking German, but what he didn't know was that I'd spent 6 years studying the language in college. I'd even lived in Munich for a semester during my graduate studies. Those skills had grown rusty over the decades, but they were still there, buried under years of American suburban life. What I heard made my blood turn cold. The old man trusts me completely now, Mason was saying in German. Sarah still has doubts about the timeline, but I'm working on her. The house is worth at least 400,000, maybe more with the current market. I stood frozen by the door, afraid to move and alert him to my presence. No, he's not suspicious at all. He thinks I'm the perfect son-in-law. Sarah believes we're doing this for his own good, to protect him from making poor decisions in his grief. Mason laughed, a sound that chilled me. She actually thinks we're helping him. My heart hammered against my ribs. I pressed myself against the doorframe, hidden by the shadow but close enough to hear every word. The memory tests are brilliant, Mason continued. I've been moving small things around the house, nothing obvious. Car keys, his reading glasses, bills he thought he paid. When Sarah finds them in strange places, she gets more worried about his mental state. I thought about the frustrating mornings when I couldn't find my glasses, the bills that seemed to disappear and reappear, the growing concern in Sarah's eyes when she'd ask if I was feeling all right. It hadn't been grief making me forgetful. It had been Mason. 3 months, maybe 4 at most, he said. Once we have medical documentation of his declining state, we can move forward with the power of attorney. Sarah's nursing background makes her testimony very credible. The words hit me like physical blows. My own daughter, my Sarah, was being manipulated into believing I was losing my mind, and I was meant to be the victim of whatever plan they were hatching. Yes, I understand the legal requirements, Mason continued, his voice taking on a business-like tone. The house will need to be sold to pay for his care in the facility. Sarah will handle the medical decisions, but the financial power of attorney comes to me as her husband. Standard procedure when the family member is too emotionally involved to make objective choices about expensive care. Care facility. They were planning to put me in a nursing home and sell my house, the house Eleanor and I had bought as newlyweds, where we'd raised Sarah, where every room held 30 years of memories. Don't worry about Sarah's conscience, Mason said with confidence. She's a good daughter who wants what's best for her father. By the time we're done, she'll believe that putting him in professional care is the kindest thing we can do. My legs felt weak. I gripped the doorframe to steady myself. The inheritance is just sitting there, Mason continued. 400,000 in the house, plus his retirement accounts, plus whatever life insurance is left from the wife's death. He's living like a hermit anyway, barely leaving the house except for groceries. At least this way the money will do some good for people who can actually enjoy it. The casual way he referred to Eleanor as the wife made my hands clench into fists. This man was planning to steal everything Eleanor and I had worked for our entire lives, and he was using our daughter to do it. I have to go, Sarah's making coffee, and I need to be the concerned son-in-law again. He chuckled. Tomorrow I'm going to suggest he see his doctor about the memory issues. For his own safety, of course. I heard his footsteps approaching the house and quickly retreated to my study, closing the door softly behind me. My hands were shaking as I sat down at my desk, trying to process what I'd just learned. Sarah called out cheerfully, "Dad, we brought coffee cake from that bakery you like." I forced my voice to sound normal. "Be right there, sweetheart." But as I walked toward the kitchen to face my daughter and her husband, I realized that the man I'd welcomed into my family, the man I'd trusted with my daughter's happiness, was planning to destroy me, and he was so confident in his manipulation that he'd turned my own child into an unwitting accomplice. The worst part was the look of genuine concern in Sarah's eyes when she handed me my coffee. She really believed something was wrong with me. Mason had been so skillful in his deception that my loving daughter was already grieving the father she thought she was losing to dementia. I sat there at my kitchen table, smiling and making small talk while my heart broke into pieces. Mason chatted about his job search, Sarah worried aloud about my eating habits, and I pretended everything was normal while planning my next move. Because if Mason thought he was dealing with a confused old man whose grief had made him vulnerable, he was about to discover just how wrong he was about David Mitchell. The next morning, I woke up with a terrible clarity that comes only from having your world turned upside down. As I made my coffee, I noticed my reading glasses weren't on the kitchen counter where I always left them. Instead, they were sitting on top of the refrigerator, a place I would never put them. Mason had been busy. I found them there just as Sarah knocked on my front door, letting herself in with the spare key I'd given her after Eleanor's funeral. She was carrying a small notebook and wearing her concerned daughter expression. "Morning, Dad. How are you feeling today?" She studied my face like she was conducting a medical assessment. "Fine, sweetheart. Just looking for my glasses." I gestured toward the refrigerator. "Found them in the strangest place." Sarah's face fell. She made a note in her little book. "Dad, we talked about this yesterday. You said you've been having trouble remembering where you put things. Had we talked about that?" I tried to remember our conversation, but Mason had dominated most of it with stories about his job interviews. "I don't recall mentioning any memory problems. You said you couldn't find your car keys for 2 hours on Tuesday. And last week you thought you'd paid the electric bill, but I found it under a pile of newspapers unmarked." Her voice carried the gentle patience nurses use with confused patients. The electric bill. I remembered sitting at this same kitchen table, writing that check, sealing the envelope. I had no memory of putting it under newspapers, because I hadn't. "Maybe I should start keeping better track of things," I said carefully. "That's actually why I'm here." Sarah pulled out a pamphlet from her purse. "I picked this up at the hospital. It's about normal aging versus concerning memory changes. I thought we could go through it together." The pamphlet was titled, "When Memory Loss Becomes a Problem, a Family Guide." Inside were checklists and warning signs, small illustrations of confused elderly people, and information about medical evaluations. "Sarah, I appreciate your concern, but I think you might be overreacting. Dad, yesterday you asked me the same question 3 times about Mason's job search. You didn't remember our conversation from Sunday about changing your bank statements to electronic delivery." She reached across the table and took my hand. "I'm worried about you." I had no memory of asking repeated questions. I distinctly remembered our conversation about bank statements, and I'd never agreed to change anything. But looking at my daughter's face, seeing her genuine fear and love, I realized how skillfully Mason had been orchestrating this campaign. "What exactly are you suggesting?" I asked. "Just a checkup with Dr. Harrison. Maybe some simple tests to establish a baseline. If everything's normal, great. If there are early signs of something, it's better to know so we can plan ahead." Dr. Harrison had been my physician for 15 years. A good man, but he'd rely on family observations to assess cognitive changes. If Sarah came to the appointment armed with examples of my supposed confusion documented in her careful nursing notes, he'd have no reason to doubt her professional assessment. "I suppose it wouldn't hurt," I said finally. Sarah's relief was visible. "I already called his office. They can see you next Friday if that works for you." Of course, she'd already made the appointment. Mason's timeline was moving forward exactly as planned. After Sarah left, I spent the morning conducting my own investigation. I searched through my house systematically, looking for evidence of Mason's manipulations. In my bedroom, I found my prescription medication bottles in the wrong order in my medicine cabinet. My checkbook was in the kitchen junk drawer instead of my desk where I always kept it. Most disturbing was what I found in my study. Papers from my retirement account had been moved. Not stolen, just displaced enough to create confusion. My investment statements were in a folder where I kept utility bills. My insurance policies were mixed in with old tax returns. If I'd been genuinely experiencing memory problems, these discoveries would have been terrifying confirmation that my mind was failing. Instead, they were proof that someone with access to my house had been systematically creating evidence of my mental decline. Mason had been very clever. Nothing was missing or obviously disturbed. To anyone else, it would look like the confused wanderings of a man whose grief had affected his organizational abilities. Only someone who knew their own habits intimately would recognize the subtle wrongness of every displaced item. My phone rang around noon. Mason's voice was warm and concerned. "David, Sarah mentioned she stopped by this morning. I hope you don't mind that we're worried about you." "Not at all. Families should look out for each other." "Exactly. That's why I wanted to call. I've been doing some research about memory issues in men your age. There are some excellent facilities in the area that specialize in helping people maintain independence while getting the support they need." Facilities. He was already planting seeds about long-term care. "That's thoughtful of you, Mason, but I think we're getting ahead of ourselves. I'm seeing Dr. Harrison next week for a routine checkup." Of course. I just want you to know that Sarah and I are here to help with whatever you need. Your family, David. We want what's best for you." The sincerity in his voice was masterful. If I hadn't overheard his phone conversation, I would have been touched by his concern. Instead, every caring word felt like another thread in the web he was weaving around me. "I appreciate that, Mason. Eleanor always said Sarah chose well when she married you." A pause. "She was a wonderful woman. I know how much you miss her. Every day." That much was true. But Eleanor's memory was also becoming Mason's weapon against me. My grief was being used as evidence of my vulnerability, my isolation as proof that I needed professional care. After we hung up, I sat in Eleanor's favorite chair and tried to think clearly. Mason was moving quickly now, probably because he was confident in his psychological manipulation. Sarah truly believed I was declining. Dr. Harrison would likely find concerning evidence, because my loving family was documenting my confusion so carefully. Within months, maybe weeks, I could find myself declared incompetent to manage my own affairs. Mason would gain financial control as Sarah's husband. The house would be sold to pay for my care, and everything Eleanor and I had built together would disappear into their bank accounts. The beauty of his plan was that Sarah would believe she was saving me. Her nursing training made her observations credible. Her genuine love for me made her advocacy unquestionable. She would sign whatever documents were necessary, convinced she was protecting her father from himself, and Mason would be the grieving son-in-law, reluctantly taking on the burden of managing my finances because it was too emotionally difficult for my daughter to handle alone. That evening, I made myself a simple dinner and sat down with a legal pad to plan my counterattack. If Mason wanted to play psychological games, he'd chosen the wrong opponent. I'd spent 3 decades teaching young people to think critically, to question sources, to recognize bias and manipulation in historical narratives. Now, I needed to apply those same skills to my own life. First, I would document everything. Every displaced item, every conversation, every example of Mason's helpful suggestions. I would create my own timeline and evidence file. Second, I would research Mason's background more thoroughly. Sarah had met him online, a whirlwind courtship that led to marriage within 8 months. At the time, I'd been charmed by their happiness. Now I wondered what I might have missed in my eagerness to see my daughter settled. Third, I would need allies, people who knew me well enough to testify to my mental acuity, who could provide independent observations about my behavior and capabilities. And finally, I would need to be very, very careful. Mason was intelligent and ruthless, but he was also arrogant. He believed he was dealing with a grieving widower whose isolation made him vulnerable. He had no idea that David Mitchell had just declared war. As I sat there making my plans, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Eleanor's death, a sense of purpose. Mason had awakened the fighter in me, the man who'd worked 2 jobs to put himself through graduate school, who'd built a career from nothing, who'd raised a strong daughter despite every obstacle life threw at us. He'd made one crucial mistake in his assessment of my character. He thought grief had made me weak. Tomorrow he would start to learn just how wrong he was. I spent the weekend preparing for what I knew would be the most important conversation of my life. Every detail had to be perfect, every word calculated. Mason thought he was dealing with a confused old man, but I was about to show him exactly who David Mitchell really was. On Monday morning, I called Mason directly. "I was wondering if you'd like to join me for lunch today," I said, keeping my voice casual. "There's something I'd like to discuss with you man to man." I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. "Of course, David. I'm glad you're reaching out. Sarah and I have been concerned about you being alone so much. How about Gerhardt's, that German restaurant downtown? I thought you might enjoy something that reminds you of home." "That's very thoughtful. Noon? Perfect." Gerhardt's was dim and quiet during lunch hours, with heavy wooden tables and traditional German music playing softly in the background. I arrived first and chose a corner booth where we wouldn't be overheard. When Mason walked in, I watched him take in the familiar atmosphere, his shoulders relaxing slightly as he spotted me. "This is wonderful, David," he said, sliding into the booth across from me. "I haven't been to a proper German restaurant since I moved here." The waitress approached with menus. I smiled at her warmly. "Guten Tag. Könnten wir bitte mit der deutschen Speisekarte beginnen?" Mason's face went completely white. The menu slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the table. For a long moment he just stared at me, his mouth slightly open as if I'd just spoken in an alien language, which from his perspective I suppose I had. "Sie sprechen Deutsch," he whispered. "Fließend," I replied calmly. "I studied it for 6 years in college, lived in Munich for a semester. Fascinating city, perhaps you know it." The waitress, delighted to have German-speaking customers, launched into enthusiastic recommendations. I ordered for both of us in German, maintaining casual conversation about the menu while watching Mason struggle to process this new reality. When the waitress left, Mason finally found his voice. "David, I had no idea you spoke German. Sarah never mentioned—" "Sarah doesn't know. It never came up in conversation." I leaned back in my chair, studying his face. "Amazing how much you can learn about people when they think you don't understand what they're saying." The color drained completely from his face. "I'm not sure what you mean. Let me refresh your memory. Thursday afternoon, in my backyard. You were on the phone, speaking quite freely about your plans for my house, my inheritance, and my daughter's role in facilitating my placement in a care facility." Mason's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his water glass. "David, I think there's been a misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding at all. Your German is quite clear, by the way. Excellent pronunciation. You spoke about moving my belongings around the house to create evidence of memory problems. You mentioned using Sarah's nursing credentials to document my declining mental state. You discussed the timeline for gaining power of attorney and liquidating my assets." I spoke quietly, conversationally, as if we were discussing the weather, but I watched every micro-expression cross his face. The fear, the calculation, the desperate search for an escape route. "You're confused," he said finally. "Grief can sometimes cause people to misinterpret innocent conversations." "Innocent?" I switched to German. "Tell me, Mason, which part was innocent? The part where you called me the old man who trusts you completely, or the part where you laughed about Sarah believing she was helping me?" His face crumpled. In his native language, he couldn't maintain the same level of deception he managed in English. The psychological advantage of speaking in his mother tongue also worked against him now. "David, please let me explain." "Oh, I think you've explained quite enough, but I'm curious about one thing." I leaned forward. "How long have you been planning this? Was it before Eleanor died, or did her funeral give you the idea?" "It's not what you think." "Really? Because what I think is that you married my daughter to gain access to my family's assets. What I think is that you've been systematically gaslighting me for months, moving my belongings and creating false evidence of dementia. What I think is that you've manipulated my grieving daughter into believing her father is losing his mind, so she'll willingly sign documents giving you control over everything I own." Mason stared at his hands. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible. "I have debts. Back in Germany. People who don't accept late payments kindly. Gambling debts." A nod. "How much?" 80,000 euros, plus interest that keeps growing." I felt a cold satisfaction. The missing piece of the puzzle had just fallen into place. And you thought my house and retirement savings would solve your problem. Sarah doesn't know, she can't know. These people, they're dangerous. If I don't pay them soon. So you decided to steal from your wife's family instead of telling her the truth. It wasn't supposed to hurt anyone. You'd be taken care of in a good facility. Sarah would never have to worry about your safety or manage your care alone. The money would just go to better use. The casual way he rationalized destroying my life made my anger burn cold and steady. Better use, I see. And what happens when Sarah discovers that her beloved husband is a gambling addict who stole her inheritance? She doesn't have to find out. Ever. Really? You think you can keep that secret forever? Mason looked up at me with desperate eyes. David, please. I know how this looks. But I love Sarah. I love her more than anything. That's why I can't tell her about the debts. It would destroy her. No, Mason, what would destroy her is learning that her husband is a liar and a thief who manipulated her into betraying her own father. Our food arrived, and we sat in silence while the waitress arranged our plates. The traditional German meal smelled wonderful, but neither of us touched it. What do you want? Mason asked finally. What I want is for you to tell Sarah the truth. All of it. The gambling, the debts, the plan to steal my assets. I want you to explain how you've been moving things around my house and coaching her to believe I'm mentally incompetent. I can't do that. Then I'll do it for you. She won't believe you. She's documented too many incidents of your confusion. Dr. Harrison will confirm that you're experiencing cognitive decline based on her professional observations. He was right, and we both knew it. Sarah's careful notes, her nursing expertise, her genuine concern for my welfare, all of it would work against me if I tried to expose Mason's deception without proof. Perhaps, I said, but I have something you don't. What? Time and patience. And most importantly, I have the advantage of knowing exactly who you are while you still think you're dealing with a confused old man. Mason's face hardened. What are you saying? I'm saying that your plan has a fatal flaw. You assumed I was helpless, isolated and dependent on Sarah's protection. You underestimated me completely. I stood up and placed enough money on the table to cover our untouched meals. Enjoy your lunch, Mason. Think carefully about our conversation. Because this is the only warning you're going to get. Warning about what? I smiled down at him, and for the first time since Eleanor's death, I felt completely in control of my life. I spent 30 years teaching students how to research the truth, how to document evidence, and how to expose lies. I know how to build a case that will stand up to scrutiny, and unlike you, I'm not operating under a deadline imposed by dangerous creditors. I leaned closer, speaking quietly in German so only he could hear. You wanted to play games with an old man's mind? Let's see how well you handle having someone play games with yours. As I walked away, leaving Mason sitting alone at that table in stunned silence, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Eleanor would have called it righteous anger. My students would have recognized it as the look I got when I was about to dismantle a poorly researched argument. Mason had made the mistake of thinking that grief had made me weak. Instead, he'd just awakened something in me that had been dormant since my wife's death. The fierce protectiveness of a man who'd built everything he had through honest work and wasn't about to let anyone take it away. The real game was just beginning, and this time I would be the one setting the rules. The next morning, Sarah called before I'd finished my first cup of coffee. Her voice was tight with an emotion I couldn't quite identify, anger mixed with something that sounded like betrayal. Dad, I need to talk to you. Now. Of course, sweetheart. Come over whenever you'd like. I'm already in your driveway. Through my kitchen window, I could see her sitting in her car, phone pressed to her ear, staring at my front door. Even from a distance, her body language screamed confrontation. She knocked once and let herself in, not waiting for me to answer. Her face was flushed, her nursing bag clutched in one hand like a weapon. Mason told me about yesterday. I poured her a cup of coffee, keeping my movements calm and deliberate. Did he? What did he say? He said you've been acting paranoid and aggressive, that you accused him of stealing from you, speaking in German, making wild claims about conversations he never had. She set her bag down hard on my kitchen table. Dad, what's happening to you? The disappointment in her voice cut deeper than any anger could have. This was my daughter, my little girl who used to climb into my lap when thunderstorms scared her. Now she was looking at me like I'd become a stranger. What exactly did Mason tell you? That you invited him to lunch and then started speaking German, claiming you understood conversations he'd had on the phone. Dad, Mason barely speaks German himself. He's told you that his English is much stronger than his native language. I stared at her. The lie was so bold, so complete, that for a moment I wondered if I'd imagined the entire conversation. Sarah, you know I studied German in college. No, Dad. You studied history. Your graduate work was in American Civil War history. We've talked about this hundreds of times. Her voice carried the patient tone of someone correcting a confused patient. You're mixing up memories. The gaslighting had extended to my own daughter. Mason had been even more thorough than I'd realized. Sweetheart, I have my college transcripts, my diploma from the University of Munich exchange program, photos from my semester abroad. Dad, you never studied abroad. You met Mom at Indiana State University in 1995, got married in 96, and I was born in 98. You never left the country until our family vacation to Canada when I was 12. The certainty in her voice shook me. Either I was losing my mind completely, or Mason had spent months rewriting our family history in Sarah's memory. Let me show you the documents. What documents? Dad, yesterday you couldn't remember where you put your reading glasses. Last week you forgot you'd already paid the electric bill. Now you're claiming you speak fluent German and have international education credentials. I walked to my study, Sarah following close behind. I opened my filing cabinet to the folder marked Education Records and found it empty. My college transcripts were gone. My Munich program certificate was missing. Even my old passport was nowhere to be found. They were here, I said, my voice sounding weak even to myself. Dad, sit down. Sarah's nurse training kicked in, her voice becoming gentle but firm. These false memories, the paranoid thoughts about Mason, the confusion about your education, they're all symptoms. Doctor, Harrison needs to see you immediately. Sarah, I'm telling you the truth. Mason has been moving things around this house for months. He's been creating evidence that I'm mentally incompetent so he can gain control of my finances. Why would Mason want your finances? Dad, we pay your bills. We buy your groceries. You barely have enough monthly income to cover your basic expenses. I stared at her. What are you talking about? I have my teacher's pension, Social Security, the life insurance from your mother's death, and this house is worth at least $400,000. Dad, your pension is $350 a month. Your Social Security is $620. Mum's life insurance paid for her funeral expenses and medical bills. There was barely anything left over. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. And the house, Dad. You took out a reverse mortgage 2 years ago when money got tight. Most of the equity is already gone. The room seemed to spin around me. That's not true. I never took out a reverse mortgage. I would never risk this house. You were worried about covering Mom's medical expenses. Don't you remember signing the papers? I drove you to the lawyer's office myself. I felt like I was drowning. Every fact I thought I knew about my own life was being contradicted by my daughter, who had no reason to lie to me. Sarah, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Mason is manipulating both of us. Dad, Mason wasn't even here when you signed those papers. He was in Chicago interviewing for jobs. You're confused about the timeline. But I wasn't confused. I was starting to understand just how sophisticated Mason's deception had been. Somehow he'd convinced Sarah that I was financially desperate instead of financially secure. He'd rewritten my educational background to eliminate my German language skills. He'd stolen my documentation and replaced my memories with his own version of events. Call Dr. Harrison, Sarah said firmly. I'm making you an emergency appointment for this afternoon. And if I refuse, her face crumpled. Dad, I can't watch you deteriorate like this. If you won't get help voluntarily, I'll have to pursue other options. The threat was clear. If I didn't cooperate with the mental health evaluation, Sarah would initiate involuntary commitment proceedings. As a registered nurse, her professional assessment would carry significant weight with any court. What other options? Adult protective services, a competency hearing, whatever it takes to make sure you're safe and getting appropriate care. I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, and saw a woman who genuinely believed she was saving her father from himself. The love in her eyes was real, but it had been weaponized against me so skillfully that she couldn't see the truth, even when it was right in front of her. All right, I said quietly, and call Dr. Harrison. Relief flooded her face. Thank you, Dad. I know this is hard, but we're going to get through it together. After she left to make the appointment, I sat alone in my study trying to piece together what had happened. Mason hadn't just been moving my belongings around to confuse me. He'd been systematically erasing evidence of my competence while building a false narrative about my financial and mental state. Somehow he'd convinced Sarah that I was broke instead of financially secure. He'd eliminated all evidence of my German language skills. Most importantly, he'd positioned himself as the concerned son-in-law trying to help his wife care for her declining father, rather than the predator who was orchestrating the entire crisis. My phone rang around noon. Dr. Harrison's office had an opening at 3 o'clock. Sarah would drive me there herself to make sure I didn't forget or get confused about the appointment. I spent the afternoon thinking about Eleanor. She'd always been the one who could see through people's deceptions, who noticed when someone's words didn't match their actions. If she were alive, she would have seen through Mason immediately. But Eleanor was gone, and I was fighting this battle alone against an opponent who had turned my own daughter into his unwitting ally. At 2:30, Sarah arrived to drive me to the doctor's office. During the 20-minute drive, she chatted nervously about the beautiful fall weather, about her work at the hospital, about anything except the real reason we were going. "I love you, Dad," she said as we pulled into the medical building parking lot. "Whatever happens, remember that. I love you too, sweetheart, more than you know." But as we walked into Dr. Harrison's office, I realized that love might not be enough to save either of us from what Mason had set in motion. He'd been so thorough in his manipulation that even proving my sanity might not be sufficient to expose his deception. Sarah truly believed she was protecting me. Dr. Harrison would rely on her professional observations to guide his assessment, and Mason would continue playing the role of the devoted son-in-law who only wanted what was best for his wife's family. I was about to undergo a mental competency evaluation orchestrated by a man who was planning to steal everything I owned, administered by a doctor who trusted my daughter's nursing judgment, observed by a daughter who'd been convinced I was losing my mind. As I sat in that waiting room, surrounded by pamphlets about memory loss and aging, I realized that Mason's plan was even more brilliant than I'd initially understood. He hadn't just been preparing to steal my money. He'd been preparing to steal my daughter's trust, my doctor's confidence, and my own sense of reality. The only question now was whether I was strong enough to fight back before it was too late. Dr. Harrison's evaluation was exactly what I'd expected. Sarah sat in the corner taking notes while I struggled through memory tests that had been designed to highlight my supposed confusion. When asked about recent events, I mentioned Mason's phone conversation in German, only to have Sarah gently correct me about my imagined language skills. "Mr. Mitchell seems to be experiencing some significant memory distortions," Dr. Harrison concluded. "The paranoid ideation about his son-in-law combined with false memories about his educational background suggests we should consider more comprehensive testing." Sarah squeezed my hand. "Whatever you recommend, Doctor. I'd like to schedule him for a full neuropsychological evaluation next week. In the meantime, I'm recommending that someone stay with him or check on him daily. These kinds of delusions can sometimes lead to poor decision-making." As we drove home, Sarah was quieter than usual. Finally, she spoke. "Dad, Dr. Harrison thinks it would be best if you weren't alone so much. Mason and I were wondering if you'd like to stay with us for a while, just until we figure out what's going on." The trap was closing. Once I was in their house under their constant supervision, Mason would have complete control over my environment and my interactions with the outside world. That's very kind, but I'm comfortable in my own home. "But Dad, what if you get confused and forget to turn off the stove? Or what if you fall and no one's there to help you?" Every argument was reasonable, every concern rooted in genuine love. That's what made Mason's manipulation so effective. "Let me think about it," I said. That evening, alone in my house, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible a week earlier. If Mason wanted to play psychological warfare, I would fight fire with fire. But first, I needed to understand exactly who I was dealing with. I started with the internet. Social media had made background research easier than ever, and I'd taught enough students about digital literacy to know how to dig deep. What I found about Mason Kruger was troubling but not surprising. His Facebook profile showed a carefully curated life of happiness with Sarah, but his older posts told a different story. Photos from Germany showed him at casinos, horse racing tracks, and poker tournaments. The captions were in German, but I could translate them easily. "Another lucky night at the tables. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose big." What happens in Monte Carlo stays in Monte Carlo. I found forum posts under usernames that matched his gaming handles, discussing strategies for high-stakes betting and complaints about temporary setbacks. Most damaging was a series of posts from 8 months ago about new opportunities in America and securing a stable financial future. The timeline was damning. Mason had started posting about financial opportunities in America just 2 months after he'd married Sarah. But I needed more than internet research. I needed someone with professional investigative skills who could verify what I was discovering. That's when I remembered Jim Rodriguez. Jim had been one of my students 15 years ago, a quiet kid who'd gone on to become a private investigator after his military service. He'd stayed in touch over the years, sending me Christmas cards and occasional updates about his work. If anyone could help me build a solid case against Mason, it would be Jim. I called him the next morning. "Professor Mitchell, this is a surprise. How are you holding up since Mrs. Mitchell passed?" "That's actually why I'm calling, Jim. I need professional help with a family situation." I spent an hour explaining everything I'd discovered about Mason, the phone conversation, the systematic gaslighting, and Sarah's unwitting participation in the deception. Jim listened without interruption, occasionally asking for clarification about dates and details. "This is sophisticated stuff, Professor. Your son-in-law understands psychological manipulation at a professional level, but if what you're telling me is accurate, he's made some mistakes that we can exploit." "What kind of mistakes?" "First, he's been too thorough in covering his tracks, removing all evidence of your German education, altering financial records, rewriting family history. That level of deception requires documentation. There'll be a paper trail somewhere." "What else?" "He's operating under time pressure because of his gambling debts. Desperate people make rushed decisions. If we can identify his creditors, we might be able to predict his next moves." Jim agreed to take the case, but he warned me about the challenges ahead. "The biggest problem is your daughter's involvement. Even if we prove Mason is a fraud, Sarah's been manipulated so thoroughly that she might not believe the evidence. We need to be very careful about how we present our findings." "What do you recommend?" "Let me do some preliminary investigation. I have contacts in Germany who can verify his background and debt situation. Meanwhile, you need to start documenting everything in real time. Hidden cameras, audio recordings, detailed notes about every interaction. Is that legal? In your own home? Absolutely. And if Mason is planning to have you declared incompetent, we'll need every piece of evidence we can gather to prove your mental acuity." After hanging up with Jim, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Eleanor's death: hope. For the first time, I wasn't fighting this battle alone. I spent the rest of the week setting up what Jim called a documentation system. I installed small security cameras in my study, living room, and kitchen, areas where Mason spent the most time during his visits. I started keeping a detailed journal of every conversation, every moved object, every example of his manipulative behavior. Most importantly, I began recording our phone conversations. Indiana was a one-party consent state, which meant I could legally record any conversation I participated in without informing the other party. The recordings proved invaluable almost immediately. On Thursday, Mason called to check on me, his voice full of fake concern. "David, Sarah told me about your doctor's appointment. I'm so sorry you're going through this difficult time." "Thank you, Mason. It's been challenging. I want you to know that whatever happens, your family, Sarah and I will make sure you get the best possible care." "I appreciate that. Actually, that's why I'm calling. Sarah and I have been researching memory care facilities in the area. There's a wonderful place called Sunset Manor that specializes in patients with your type of condition." My blood ran cold. They were already looking at nursing homes. "I haven't been diagnosed with anything yet, Mason." "Of course not. I just think it's wise to be prepared. The waiting lists at good facilities can be quite long, and if your condition progresses quickly, we want to make sure you have options." I kept my voice calm and cooperative. "That's very thoughtful planning. I've already called Sunset Manor and scheduled a tour for next week, just to see what's available, you understand. Sarah thought you might feel more comfortable if I handled the initial inquiries." "What does a place like that cost?" "It's expensive, I won't lie. About $8,000 a month for memory care. But that's where selling your house becomes necessary. The equity will cover your care for quite a while. $8,000 a month. At that rate, the proceeds from my house would last less than 4 years. After that, I'd be dependent on Medicaid in whatever state facility would accept me. Of course, Sarah and I would supplement the costs as much as we can, Mason continued. We'd never let money be a barrier to your getting proper care. The generous offer from a man who was planning to steal my entire inheritance was particularly galling. I'm grateful for your support, Mason. Family takes care of family, David. That's what Eleanor would have wanted. After he hung up, I sat in my kitchen reviewing what I'd just learned. Mason was moving faster than I'd anticipated. The nursing home tour meant he was preparing to implement the final phase of his plan within weeks, not months. I called Jim immediately. He's accelerating the timeline, I told him. I need those German investigation results as soon as possible. I should have preliminary information by tomorrow. But Professor, I need to warn you about something. Even if we prove Mason is a fraud, the legal system moves slowly. If your daughter signs commitment papers based on Dr. Harrison's evaluation, you could be in a facility before we can present our evidence in court. What are you suggesting? We might need to take a more direct approach, force Mason's hand before he's ready to implement his final plan. How? Make him believe his deception has been discovered by someone other than you. Someone whose credibility he can't question and whose investigation he can't control. I thought about Jim's suggestion. Mason's plan depended on everyone believing I was a confused old man whose paranoid delusions made him an unreliable witness. But what if the accusations came from a source he couldn't discredit? What did you have in mind? Let me work on that. In the meantime, keep documenting everything. And, Professor, yes? Be very careful. Men like Mason become dangerous when they feel cornered. If he realizes you're building a case against him, he might try to accelerate his timeline even further. As I prepared for bed that night, I thought about Jim's warning. Mason had already demonstrated his willingness to psychologically torture an elderly man and manipulate a loving daughter. If his financial situation was as desperate as I suspected, there was no telling how far he might go to protect his scheme. But I'd spent my entire career studying human nature through the lens of history. I understood that bullies and con artists shared one crucial weakness. Their confidence was built on their victims' helplessness. Mason's greatest mistake was underestimating me. He'd seen a grieving widower and assumed I'd be easy prey. He had no idea he was dealing with a man who'd spent 30 years teaching students to think critically, research thoroughly, and never accept the obvious explanation when the evidence pointed in a different direction. Tomorrow, Jim would provide me with proof of Mason's real background and debts. Armed with that information, I would finally be ready to turn the tables on the man who thought he could steal my life and destroy my family. The hunter was about to become the hunted. Jim's call came at 7 in the morning, waking me from the first peaceful sleep I'd had in weeks. Professor, we hit the jackpot. Mason Kruger isn't just a gambling addict. He's a professional con artist with a history of targeting elderly people through family connections. I sat up in bed, fully alert. Tell me everything. My contact in Munich found records of 3 previous cases. He married into families, gained access to elderly relatives, then systematically drained their assets before disappearing. In each case, he used similar methods: gaslighting, false medical concerns, manipulation of family members. My blood chilled. What happened to the victims? 2 died in substandard care facilities after their money ran out. The 3rd is still alive but living in poverty. Mason disappeared after cleaning out her accounts, and the family never saw him again. And Sarah? Based on the pattern, she's probably his 4th victim. He appears to target women in healthcare fields because their professional credibility makes the family manipulation more effective. I closed my eyes, thinking about my daughter's genuine concern for my welfare. She had no idea she was being used as a weapon against her own father. There's more, Professor. The gambling debts are real, but they're worse than we thought. He owes approximately 120,000 euros to some very dangerous people. According to my sources, he was given a deadline of 6 months to pay. That was 4 months ago. So he has 2 months left. Less than that. These aren't the kind of creditors who accept late payments gracefully. Jim, I need you to do something for me. I want you to call Mason directly and arrange a meeting. Don't mention me at all. Tell him you're a private investigator looking into suspicious financial activity involving elderly residents in the area. What's your plan? I'm going to force him to show his true colors in front of Sarah, but I need him to be desperate enough to make mistakes. Jim agreed to make the call. Within an hour, my phone was ringing. David, Something strange has happened. Mason's voice was tight with barely controlled panic. A private investigator called me this morning asking questions about elderly financial abuse cases in the area. He mentioned your name specifically. My name? Why would a private investigator be interested in me? I don't know, but I think someone might be investigating your family's financial situation. Maybe the bank noticed unusual account activity, or perhaps someone reported concerns about your mental state. I could hear the fear beneath his words. He was terrified that his scheme had been discovered by someone with actual authority. What should I do? Nothing. Don't talk to anyone without a lawyer present. Sarah and I will handle this. After he hung up, I called Sarah at work. Dad, Mason told me about the investigator. I think we need to move faster on getting you proper care. If there's some kind of investigation happening, we need to make sure you're protected. What are you suggesting? Come stay with us tonight. We can go to Sunset Manor tomorrow for that tour Mason arranged. If you like it there, maybe we can expedite the admission process. The final phase was accelerating exactly as I'd hoped. Mason was so panicked about the investigation that he was pushing Sarah to implement their plan immediately, before they lost control of the situation. All right, sweetheart. I'll pack a bag. That evening, I arrived at Sarah and Mason's house with a small suitcase and a hidden digital recorder in my jacket pocket. The plan was simple. I would act confused and compliant while secretly documenting Mason's behavior. When he inevitably revealed his true nature under pressure, Sarah would finally see him for what he really was. Dinner was tense. Mason barely touched his food, checking his phone constantly and jumping at every small sound. Sarah tried to maintain normal conversation, but her worry was obvious. Dad, I called Sunset Manor. They have an opening available immediately if we decide to move forward. That's unusually fast, I said. Sometimes there are last-minute cancellations, Mason explained quickly. We should take advantage of the opportunity. Around 9 o'clock, Mason's phone rang. He glanced at the caller ID and his face went white. I need to take this, he said, stepping out to the back patio. I followed him quietly, staying hidden by the sliding door but close enough to hear his conversation. He was speaking German, his voice high with panic. I need more time, he was saying. The old man is about to be committed. I'll have access to the money within days. Sarah appeared beside me, drawn by the sound of her husband's agitated voice. What's wrong? She whispered. I held up my hand for silence, then pointed to the recording app on my phone. Sarah's eyes widened, but she didn't stop me. Yes, I understand the consequences, Mason continued in German, but killing him would bring too much attention. The nursing home plan is safer. He'll be dead within a year anyway from neglect. Sarah gasped. Even without understanding German, she could hear the coldness in his tone. I don't care what the old fool thinks he knows, Mason said. His own daughter believes he's losing his mind. No one will listen to the paranoid delusions of a dementia patient. I turned to Sarah and began translating in real time, keeping my voice low. He's talking about needing more time to access money. He mentioned something about me being committed and neglect in a nursing home. Sarah stared at me in shock. Dad, you understand what he's saying? Before I could answer, Mason's voice rose in anger. The daughter is useful but naive. She actually believes she's helping her father. When this is over, I'll disappear and let her deal with the guilt of putting him in that place. I translated that sentence as well, watching my daughter's face crumble as the truth finally hit her. He's been lying about everything, she whispered. Mason was still talking, unaware that his wife was listening to every word. The private investigator is a problem, but David Mitchell is just a confused old man. Even if he tries to tell people what he knows, who's going to believe him over medical documentation? Dad, Sarah said quietly, how long have you understood German? 6 years of college study, plus a semester in Munich. I tried to tell you, but Mason convinced you I was having false memories. Sarah's face went through a series of emotions: confusion, realization, horror, and finally, rage. Mason finished his call and turned back toward the house. When he saw us standing there, his expression shifted from relief to terror in an instant. Sarah, I can explain. Explain what? Sarah's voice was deadly calm. Explain how you've been lying to me about my father's education. Explain how you've been planning to put him in a nursing home where he'll die from neglect. Explain how you called me naive and useful. Mason's face cycled through denial, bargaining, and finally, desperate anger. You don't understand the situation I'm in, he said, switching to English. These people will kill me if I don't pay them. I had no choice. You had the choice to tell me the truth, Sarah shot back. You had the choice to ask for help instead of destroying my family. Your father is going to die anyway. He's old, he's alone, he's depressed since Eleanor died. At least this way, his money goes to someone who can actually use it. The mask had finally come off completely. This was the real Mason, calculating, cold, and utterly without remorse for the lives he was willing to destroy. Sarah stepped closer to her husband, her voice shaking with fury. "Get out of my house. Sarah, be reasonable. Get out," she screamed. "Take whatever you can carry and leave. If you're not gone in 10 minutes, I'm calling the police." Mason looked back and forth between us, probably calculating whether he could still salvage the situation. But the recordings on my phone, Sarah's newfound awareness of his deception, and the investigation Jim was conducting had destroyed any possibility of continuing his scheme. "You're making a mistake," he said finally. "Without me, you'll have to watch your father deteriorate alone. At least I was offering you a solution. The only mistake I made was trusting you," Sarah replied. Mason stormed into the house to pack his belongings. Sarah and I sat on the back patio in silence, listening to him crash around inside. "Dad, I'm so sorry," she said finally. "I can't believe I was ready to have you committed based on his lies. You were trying to protect me. That's what daughters do. But I should have listened to you. I should have questioned his version of events. Mason is very skilled at manipulation. He's done this before, Sarah. You weren't his first victim." She looked at me with tears in her eyes. "How do you know that?" I told her about Jim's investigation, about Mason's history of targeting elderly people through family connections, about the pattern of destruction he'd left behind in Germany. "Those other families," she said, "the people who died in bad nursing homes, that was going to be my fate if we hadn't stopped him." Mason emerged from the house 20 minutes later with 2 suitcases and a duffel bag. He paused at the patio door looking at Sarah with what might have been genuine regret. "I did love you," he said quietly. "No," Sarah replied. "You loved what I could do for you. There's a difference." After he left, Sarah and I spent the rest of the evening going through the evidence I'd collected, the recordings, the photographs, Jim's investigative reports. By morning, we had enough documentation to file criminal charges and ensure that Mason could never victimize another family. But more importantly, I had my daughter back. The woman who had been convinced I was losing my mind was now my strongest ally in making sure Mason faced consequences for his actions. 3 weeks later, Mason was arrested at the airport trying to flee to Germany. The gambling debts that had driven him to target my family also ensured that he had nowhere to run where those creditors couldn't find him. Sarah filed for divorce immediately. She kept her married name just long enough to testify against him in court, then legally returned to Sarah Mitchell. "I want to remember this lesson," she told me. "I want to remember what it cost to stop questioning my own judgment." The house felt different now. Not empty like it had after Eleanor's death, but peaceful. Sarah visited regularly, not out of concern for my mental state, but because she wanted to rebuild the relationship that Mason's lies had nearly destroyed. I never did take that neuropsychological evaluation that Dr. Harrison had recommended. Sarah explained the situation to him, and he agreed that my supposed symptoms had been the result of systematic psychological abuse rather than cognitive decline. 6 months later, I started teaching again. Not full-time, but as a guest lecturer at the community college. My story had become a case study in elder abuse prevention, and I found purpose in educating others about the warning signs I'd missed until it was almost too late. Mason was sentenced to 8 years in prison for elder abuse, fraud, and attempted theft. The judge noted that his sophisticated psychological manipulation had made him particularly dangerous to vulnerable populations. "Your actions," the judge said during sentencing, "represent a betrayal of the most fundamental human bonds of trust and family." I didn't attend the sentencing hearing. I didn't need to see Mason in handcuffs to feel vindicated. My victory wasn't his imprisonment. It was the quiet evening meals I now shared with my daughter, the honest conversations about our family's future, and the knowledge that I'd fought back against someone who'd tried to steal not just my money, but my relationship with the person I loved most. Sometimes Sarah asks me how I knew to fight back when everything seemed hopeless. The answer is simple. Eleanor had taught me that love worth having is love worth defending. And some battles are too important to lose, no matter how overwhelming the odds might seem. The man who thought he could destroy me because I was old and alone discovered that age brings wisdom and that loneliness is no match for determination. Most importantly, he learned that underestimating a retired history professor is a mistake that can cost you everything. Today, I wake up in my own bed, in my own house, surrounded by my own possessions and my own memories. My money remains in my control, my daughter knows the truth, and my future belongs to me. That's not just victory, that's freedom.